Nathan Davis here for NHDPHOTO. Today I want to go over the basics of an exposure. Now there are three things that make up an exposure: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. It was also called ASA in the film days, but we're talking digital today. Now, shutter speed is the amount of time the shutter is open. Now, a shutter is basically a physical plane in front of your recording medium that opens and closes to expose the recording medium to light. Not all cameras have that, though. With digital cameras, you do have point-and-shoot cameras that do not have, and newer cameras like newer mirrorless DSLRs that don't have a physical shutter, that there's nothing there that's actuating. There's no physical medium that's actuating. What it's doing is when you push the shutter button down, it is basically electronically capturing the image. But in the same difference, it's pretty much the same principle. Now with DSLRs or even film SLRs, you actually have a physical plane in front of the recording medium. Now, there's two different types. There's one that's called a shutter, a bladed shutter, and there's another one called a curtain. They're used interchangeably. Back in the film days, they actually had curtains, which were actually fabric shutters that would open and close. The other was a bladed shutter that was usually made out of metal or some type of plastic that would open and shut. Now with most modern DSLRs, they have a bladed shutter. Now I put my camera in mirror lockup, and I do have a flashlight. It's actually a headlamp because that's all I can find right now. Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the lift the mirror basically so you can see the shutter. Hopefully you can see there look like a series of blades, and that's called a bladed shutter, and that opens exposing the sensor to light. I don't know if you can see this without the flashlight. See that? And then the mirror and everything drops back down. It's really quick because it's set to fast. It's less than a second usually. So it opens, closes, and exposes the sensor, in this case, to light. Now that is shutter speed. It's the amount of time that plane is open, allowing light in. Now with a fast shutter speed, you can capture action. So when you're at a sporting event or whatever, you can capture the action going on. The drawback for a fast shutter speed is you need a lot of light. So usually, ideally, you want to be in bright sunlight. So when you're in a sporting event that's outside in bright sunlight, you'll have no problem getting fast shutter speeds. Now with a slow shutter speed, that's ideal for low light situations. So if you're in a darkened room or something of that nature, you can capture a proper exposure. The drawback to a slow shutter speed is the fact that any motion is going to blur the image. So if you have any action, you're not going to be able to capture it ideally at a slow shutter speed. Now, artistically, you can use that to your advantage. You know, a lot of photographers that photograph dancers and things like that want to show the fluidity of motion will do slow shutter speeds to show the streaking motion of the dance. And you know, if you do some Google searches, you'll actually find examples of that, and it's really, you know, artistic in nature, and it shows motion. So you know, you can use that to your advantage. People use it for waterfalls and fountains because it shows the motion of the water. So you know, even if it's a slow shutter speed and you're capturing action, depending on what it is, that can actually be to your advantage if you're wanting to, you know, have an artistic representation of it. Now, the second part of an exposure plays into this, which is aperture, or iris, depending on if you're talking about video. Aperture actually works like the iris of your eye. Now, when the iris of your eye is wide open, it's usually to allow more light in a low light situation so that you can see better. When you're out in a bright sunny day, your iris, constricts so that it allows less light in so you can see things properly. And in the same regards, aperture works the same way. And it works a lot like gauges too, because the smaller the number, the wider the aperture. The larger the number, the smaller the aperture. So a 2.8 would be an aperture that's really wide open, and 1 would be all the way open. So that would be the same diameter of the lens. With a small aperture like 22 or something like that, that's going to be a very pinhole size aperture. You can go to like 32 and even more, where it's really constricted down. It's only allowing a small amount of light in, and bright sunny conditions is ideal. Now again, with a stop down aperture or a small aperture, that's perfect for bright sunny days. You need a lot of light in order to expose an image. With a wide open aperture, it's ideal for low light situations. Now there are drawbacks to both, and they play into another factor, which is depth of field, and I'll touch on that. Depth of field is the area that's in focus, okay? And with a wide open aperture, it works in the same way as if you get your eyes dilated at an eye doctor. You have trouble focusing. You can only focus on small areas, and the closer something is, you really have to, struggle to focus. And that's because your eyes are dilated. So your depth of field, which is the area that you can focus on, is very narrow. And in the same regards, it works the same way with photography. And this is ideal, though, for portrait photography, because when you want to do a portrait shot, you want to have the subject in focus and the background blurred. And the best way to do that is to have a wide open aperture. So that's the downfall, though, with a wide open aperture, is that your depth of field is very, very narrow. With a stop down aperture, your depth of field is wider, but again, you need a lot of light to expose the image, or a slow shutter speed. Again, these are correlating variables that if you want to stop down the aperture, and you say stop down, it means that you're restricting the aperture. If you want to stop down the aperture, then you need to adjust your shutter speed, and the other one I will talk on ISO in a minute. So adjusting these three variables gives you the exposure. So if you want to widen out your depth of field, then you would need to stop down your aperture and adjust your shutter speed and ISO accordingly. Now your lens, and I have my 28 to 135 here, you have your focusing, where you focus your focal ring, and that allows you to move the depth of field, move that little area of focus. Now when you start getting away from the front lens element, the closer you are, it's narrower, and when you start getting away from the lens, it starts widening out. So your depth of field starts to widen out. And then you reach a point on the lens which is called infinite. Okay, if you can see it there, it's the infinite sign. It's the sideways 8. That's when you reach the distance from the lens where from that point on is in focus. Okay, and your aperture plays a factor in that. Wide open aperture, the further away it is from the lens for from that point on to be in focus. So wide open aperture, let's say it's 20 feet. So 20 feet on will be in focus if you have it in infinite. If you have a stop-down aperture, let's say 22, then it would be like, this is just spitballing, 10 feet to infinite. So that's, how it correlates to this, and when you see the infinite sign, that's what it is. It's just meaning that, you've reached the point where from that point on is in focus. And that's depth of field. Depth of field is just basically the area that's in focus. Aperture, again, plays a factor in that, and it also plays a factor in your exposure by either restricting or allowing more or less light in. So you either restrict the amount of light coming in, or you increase the amount of light coming in. And that's aperture. ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor to light. Now, or the medium, recording medium. Now, it used to be called ASA in film days until about 1995, 96, when it was changed to ISO, which is International Standards Organization. They're the ones that come up with the sensitivity standards. It used to be called American Standards Association, I think, which was ASA. And it's just basically they come up with the standards, for gauging the sensitivity. And so the lower the number, the less sensitive the medium is to light. That just means that it takes longer for the light to expose an image on that medium. If you have a larger number, so like 100 would be very low sensitivity. So you would either need a slow shutter speed or a wide open aperture to capture an image properly. 1600 would be a high ISO, and this would be used in low lighting situations where you need to get a fairly fast shutter speed, and that's a very sensitive medium, and it doesn't take as long and as much light to expose the image. Now again, there's drawbacks. With a low ISO, the drawback is you need a lot of light to actually expose the image. But you get a pristine image. Okay, and I'll explain. When you have a high ISO, you don't need as much light, but the drawback is it produces a lot of noise. And the more sensitive the sensor is to light, the more noise is created. Noise is grain. Think of like a, grain on your TV. And it's just basically the recording medium, the little individual pixels are exposing slightly differently. The more sensitive it is, it means that they're more erratic in their exposure. Because the exposure happens on the pixel level, okay? So each individual pixel is exposing the image slightly different, just slightly, and so it produces grain or noise. Now, at low sensitivity, it's very nominal, so you're not going to see the grain or noise. It's not going to be noticeable. But as you increase the sensitivity, they become the differences become greater, and so then it becomes noticeable. So high ISO, you can expose an image in low light at a fairly decent shutter speed, but the drawback is that you will have noise in the image. Now, with newer cameras, they have built-in software in the processing of the image. The processor runs it through, and there's built-in software that actually helps reduce the amount of noise in the image. So with newer DSLR cameras, it's less of a factor. So you can take images at higher shutter speeds and not notice a great amount of noise. And that's because the technology that's been built into the camera. Now, if you take older DSLRs or older, point-and-shoot cameras as a whole, you will definitely see noise in ISOs of 400 or 800, depending on how old the digital camera is. So that's the drawback to higher ISOs. And these three factors play into a proper exposure. Now, I would recommend to actually play around with your manual settings. Play around with TV, AV, and M if you haven't done that before. If your camera has that, I would recommend doing that because that gives you an idea how these things play together. Shutter speed, again, is the amount of time that the shutter is open, or the medium is being exposed to light. The aperture is the amount of light being allowed in through the lens. And ISO is the sensitivity of the medium, the recording medium, to light. And adjusting these variables will allow for proper exposure and give you creative advantages in your photography. When you allow the camera to do it, it's going to adjust these variables to give you a proper exposure. But it does not give you the creative or artistic license to capture the image the way you want it captured. So understanding these is kind of like an artist understanding his palette and his canvas. You know, a painter has to understand how to mix the colors, how to apply them, how to layer them to get the proper effect. And in the same regards, when you're doing photography, understanding these three variables and how they correlate in producing an image will allow you to be more creative. So, again, the one example I gave was dancers. Well, if you want to capture dancers and you want to show the fluidity of motion, you would want a shutter speed that's slower. But let's say it's outdoors and it's a bright sunny day. Well, you would have to stop down the aperture to obtain a slower shutter speed, and you would also have to lower the sensitivity of the sensor to light. So you'd want a 100 ISO, or if you can, a 50 ISO. And then you would want to stop down your aperture as much as you can, like 22 or 32, 36, whatever. And that way you can get, you know, like a slower shutter speed. It might not be slow enough, but again, you can play around with those settings and figure it out how to achieve certain artistic effects. If you're at an indoor basketball game, the stadium lighting is not ideal for fast action, so you're not going to be able to capture a slam dunk, you know, perfectly paused in auto. It's not going to happen. That's one of the biggest complaints people make, is that, oh, I'm at an indoor sporting event and everything's blurred. Well, it is because you're using auto and the camera doesn't understand that you're trying to take a picture of action. It just is trying to make a proper exposure. So what you would want to do is set your ISO high. You want to open your aperture up, and that way you can get close to ideal, if not ideal, shutter speeds. So understanding that gives you more creative license. You can do a lot more understanding these three things. And yes, my overview might be brief. It may not be enough. It might get you going. It might make you want to explore these. It's not that hard. But understanding them is key. If you don't understand them, you won't get anywhere. You know, you will always be stuck with the pictures that you take in auto, and they will not always be ideal. So having that under your belt is important. So again, shutter speed is the amount of time the recording medium is exposed to light. Aperture is the amount of light that's allowed into the recording medium. And ISO is the sensitivity of the recording medium to light. That's it. Thanks for watching.